Ma'am? Ma'am, I need you to stand up. Are you under the influence of something?
She's not hearing you, officer. She's having a seizure.
Stay back, I've got an unresponsive and non-compliant suspect here. Ma'am, put your hands behind your back and stop resisting.
She can't breathe, look at her hands, she's twitching. Call an ambulance.
I'm going to need everyone to clear the area. I'm making an arrest.
The body camera footage flickers to life at 2:14 p.m. on a busy Saturday afternoon. And what it captured in the main concourse of the city's largest mall would eventually cost the taxpayers more than anyone could have imagined. A 45-year-old black woman in nursing scrubs leaned against a store window, her eyes vacant and her hands twitching rhythmically, completely unaware that the next 12 minutes would dismantle her life. The rookie officer approaching her, Tyler Vance, already had his hand resting on his belt, his walk purposeful, his mind already made up about the vagrant he thought he was seeing. What he didn't know was that the woman sliding down that glass window wasn't a shoplifter, wasn't a drug addict, and wasn't someone who deserved to be treated like a criminal. She was Elena Roberts, a head nurse who had spent 20 years in emergency rooms saving lives. Often the lives of officers just like the one now kneeling on her back. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be heard, and your subscription helps us keep bringing them to light. The mall was packed with weekend shoppers, a high-end district where families came for lunch and movies. Elena Roberts had stopped there on her way to a double shift at the hospital to pick up a birthday gift for her daughter. She had been feeling a slight aura, a warning sign she knew well, and was trying to reach a bench when the focal seizure took hold. She was tired, but focused on her work, looking forward to a quiet evening after her shift. Regular thoughts, a regular Saturday, the kind of day that shouldn't end with handcuffs, nerve damage, and news cameras. Officer Tyler Vance pulled his patrol mountain bike into the concourse at 2:13 p.m. His shift report later claimed he was responding to a report of a suspicious person acting erratically. The body camera showed something else. It showed him passing several other people who were loitering or sitting on floors and heading straight for Elena. It showed him standing over her for less than 30 seconds before deciding that her medical distress was actually criminal defiance. The first words out of Officer Vance's mouth weren't, "Are you okay?" or "Do you need a doctor?" Instead, he demanded to know what she had taken. Elena looked up, her face contorted by the neurological storm in her brain, unable to speak, and immediately, Vance's hand moved toward his cuffs. Elena Roberts moved through the world with the rhythmic efficiency of someone who measured life in heartbeats and cc's. On that bright Saturday afternoon, she was dressed in her standard uniform, Cherokee scrubs, a stethoscope-shaped pin on her lapel, and a pair of worn-in Hoka sneakers designed for 12-hour marathons on hospital linoleum. For 20 years, Elena had been the anchor of the intensive care unit, a woman who had seen the human body at its most fragile and its most resilient. She was a caregiver by trade and by soul, the kind of nurse who knew a patient's oxygen levels were dipping before the monitors even started to chime. To her colleagues, she was the general, a title earned not through iron-fisted rule, but through a calming presence that could de-escalate a panicked ER waiting room with a single, steady look. Across town, at the 4th Precinct, Officer Tyler Vance was adjusting his duty belt for the third time in front of the locker room mirror. He was barely 6 months out of the academy, his uniform still stiff with starch, his badge gleaming with a blinding, unmarred finish. To Vance, the city wasn't a collection of people in need of care. It was a grid of potential threats and subjects to be managed. He was a proactive rookie, the kind who spent his off hours studying tactical takedowns and defensive maneuvers rather than community outreach. He was eager to make a name for himself, driven by a desperate need to prove he wasn't just another recruit, but a warrior on the front lines. He viewed every interaction as a test of his authority, a mindset fueled by a department culture that often mistook aggression for command. Elena's day was supposed to be simple. She had a double shift starting at 4 p.m., but she had promised her daughter a specific pair of sneakers for her 16th birthday. She walked into the mall with her mind on her shopping list and her patient charts, unaware that a small electrical misfire was beginning to spark in her temporal lobe. It was a familiar, unwelcome hum, an aura she hadn't felt in years. As she reached for a display rack, the world began to tilt. At that same moment, Vance was pedaling his patrol bike through the concourse, his eyes scanning the crowd for anything that didn't fit his rigid definition of order. He saw a woman leaning heavily against a window, her movements erratic, her gaze unfocused. In Elena's world, this was a medical emergency. In Vance's world, this was a challenge to his precinct's zero-tolerance policy on public intoxication. The caregiver and the rookie were about to collide, and the cost of Vance's proactivity was about to be measured in millions. The air in the mall felt suddenly heavy, thick with the metallic tang that always preceded Elena's focus. "I said move," Vance shouted, stepping into Elena's personal space. He reached out and grabbed her upper arm, pulling her away from the support of the glass. The sudden movement sent Elena's system into a tailspin. Her legs buckled, not out of defiance, but because her brain was currently a storm of misfiring neurons. As she slumped toward the floor, Vance didn't see a patient. He saw a suspect going limp to resist arrest. He keyed his shoulder mic, his voice breathless and urgent. "Dispatch, I have an unresponsive and non-compliant subject at the North Concourse. She's resisting. Send backup." The crowd began to cluster, a wall of cell phones rising like a digital jury. A woman nearby yelled that Elena was sick, but Vance's internal bias had already locked the door. He saw a black woman in rumpled clothing acting erratically, and his training, the narrow, tactical kind, told him that compliance was the only cure. He didn't see the nurse, he saw the threat. As Elena's face pressed against the mall's polished tile, her cheek fluttering with the last of the tremors, Vance reached for his belt. He wasn't calling for a medic. He was reaching for the steel that would turn a medical emergency into a $7 million catastrophe. The mall's acoustics turned the sound of the first handcuff ratcheting shut into a gunshot that echoed against the marble floors. Elena was no longer twitching. She had entered the post-ictal phase, a state of profound neurological fog where the brain struggles to reboot. Her head lolled against the tile, her eyes open but seeing nothing, a trail of saliva escaping the corner of her mouth. To Officer Vance, this lack of response was active resistance through passive weight. He grunted, forcing her left arm behind her back with a levering motion that made the tendons in her shoulder scream. "Stop resisting," he bellowed. The command directed more at the gathering crowd than at the woman who barely knew her own name. The circle of bystanders tightened, a chorus of voices rising in a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between Vance's training and Elena's reality. A teenager in a fast food uniform stepped forward, hands raised, shouting that he'd seen her eyes roll back before she fell. An elderly man, a retired teacher, pointed at Elena's scrubbed top, begging the officer to look at the professional credentials pinned to her chest. But Vance was caught in the tunnel vision of a rookie who had just called for backup. To admit he was wrong now would be to admit he had lost control. He pushed his knee harder into the small of Elena's back, a tactic meant for violent felons, not a 45-year-old nurse in the middle of a medical crisis. 4 minutes in, the backup arrived. 2 more officers sprinted into the concourse, their boots thudding like a drumbeat of approaching doom. They didn't ask questions. They saw Vance struggling and jumped into the fray. Elena felt multiple hands pinning her ankles, her hips, her neck. The pressure on her chest made it impossible to expand her lungs, and for a terrifying minute, the woman who had spent her life monitoring the breathing of others began to suffocate. The world around her was a blurred mosaic of blue polyester and flickering fluorescent lights. She tried to moan, to say the word seizure, but all that emerged was a soft, guttural whimper. By minute 8, the officers had hauled her upright, her feet dragging across the floor as they marched her toward the exit. The 12 minutes of terror were nearing their peak. Elena was finally starting to regain a sliver of consciousness, but it was the worst kind of awakening. She found herself in a nightmare where she was being treated as a predator in the very place she had come to buy a birthday gift. The cold steel of the cuffs bit into her wrists, causing a sharp, electric jolt of pain that signaled the beginning of permanent nerve damage. As they shoved her into the hard plastic seat of the patrol car, the last thing she saw through the tinted window was the mall's customer service desk, a bitter irony that would later serve as a haunting backdrop for the $7 million lawsuit that would follow. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room hummed with a sterile, aggressive brightness that pierced through the final remnants of Elena's postictal fog. When her eyes finally flickered open, the world didn't rush back. It trickled in. The rhythmic hiss of an oxygen flow, the distant beep of a telemetry monitor, and the heavy, metallic scent of her own dried blood where her cheek had scraped the mall floor. Her first instinct was professional. She tried to check her own pulse, but her right hand wouldn't move. A sharp, cold tug at her wrist anchored her to the bed rail. The muffled clink of a stainless steel handcuff was a sound she had heard 1,000 times on the peripheral of her shifts, but never as a part of her own body. "Patient is awake," a voice muttered, devoid of the bedside manner Elena had practiced for 2 decades. She turned her head slowly, the movement sending a throb of pain through her neck. Standing at the foot of her bed wasn't a doctor or a fellow nurse, but a patrolman she didn't recognize, his arms crossed over a tactical vest. Beside him stood Officer Vance, his face a mask of defensive stoicism. Elena tried to speak, her throat feeling as though it were lined with sandpaper. My daughter," she managed to whisper, her mind jumping to the birthday gift left on the mall floor. Vance didn't offer her a phone or a glass of water. Instead, he pulled a thin stack of carbon copy paper from his clipboard. "Ms. Roberts, you're currently under medical observation, but you are also under arrest," he stated, his voice flat, as if reciting a script to a wall. "You're being charged with resisting a lawful order, obstructing an officer, and public nuisance." The words felt surreal, like a misdiagnosis in a language she didn't speak. Elena looked down at her left hand, where the fingers remained numb and tingly, the first signs of the nerve damage that would eventually end her career. I was having a seizure," she croaked, her eyes searching Vance's for a flicker of the empathy she had seen in the eyes of the most exhausted interns. "I'm a nurse at St. Jude's. Check my bag, my ID." "We checked your ID," the second officer interjected. "Doesn't change the fact that you refused to comply and struggled when Officer Vance tried to secure the scene. You made a choice to escalate." Elena felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the ER's air conditioning. She looked at the 4 line in her arm and then back at the steel cuff on her wrist. In this room, surrounded by the tools of healing she had mastered, she was being treated as a biological threat rather than a human being in crisis. The realization began to settle in her chest like lead. The police weren't here to protect her recovery. They were here to document her guilt, to justify their own violence. As Vance turned to leave, leaving her guarded like a violent felon in her own sanctuary, Elena realized that surviving the seizure was only the beginning. The real fight for her life was going to happen in a courtroom. The transition from lifesaver to legal combatant began not with a roar, but with a simple, devastating discovery during a follow-up appointment 3 weeks after the mall incident. Elena sat in a neurologist's office, watching as the doctor tapped a reflex hammer against her right wrist. There was no response, only a dull, hollow ache that radiated up to her elbow. The diagnosis was as clinical as it was soul-crushing. Severe ulnar and median nerve compression caused by the excessive force of the metal restraints while her muscles were in involuntary spasm. For a woman whose entire existence was predicated on the precision of her hands, the steady grip needed to insert a central line or the gentle touch required to comfort a dying patient. The news was a death sentence for her career. She was no longer the general of the ICU. She was a nurse who could no longer hold a syringe. The grief of losing her calling quickly fermented into a cold, hard clarity. Elena realized that if she remained silent, the police department's narrative that she was a non-compliant subject who had brought the violence upon herself would become the permanent record. She thought of the teenagers at the mall who had filmed her humiliation and the elderly man who had begged the officers to see her humanity. She wasn't just fighting for her lost wages. She was fighting for the version of herself that had been trampled on the mall floor. She found Marcus Thorne in a small, sunlight-starved office downtown, a civil rights attorney known more for his tenacity than his billables. When Elena walked in, her right arm cradled in a medical sling, she didn't look like a victim seeking a payday. She looked like a woman seeking an audit of the soul. She laid out her nursing credentials and her medical history, but it was the tremor in her left hand as she described the click of the handcuffs that made Thorne stop typing. He had seen hundreds of body camera videos, but the one Elena described, a medical emergency rebranded as a criminal act, was a visceral indictment of a system that prioritized ego over evidence. Thorne didn't promise her a quick victory. He warned her that the city would dig into her past, question her medical history, and attempt to use her seizure disorder against her. But as Elena looked at the permanent indentation the cuffs had left on her skin, she knew the risk was irrelevant. She signed the retainer agreement with her left hand, her signature shaky but her resolve ironclad. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was a plaintiff. The 12 minutes of terror were over, but the years of accountability were just beginning. The lawsuit wasn't about the $7 million she would eventually seek. It was about the fact that no one should ever have to wake up in a hospital bed to find their hands, and their dignity, broken by the people sworn to protect them. The legal discovery process began to pull back the curtain on the bureaucratic machinery that had worked to bury Elena Roberts long before she ever left the mall floor. When Marcus Thorne finally secured the digital records from Officer Tyler Vance's patrol laptop, the discrepancy between the lens of the camera and the stroke of the pen was staggering. In the quiet of his office, Thorne compared the body camera footage to the official shift report Vance had filed just 2 hours after the arrest. The report was a masterclass in creative writing, designed to shield a rookie from the consequences of a catastrophic mistake. In Vance's written narrative, there was no mention of a woman leaning against glass with vacant eyes. There was no mention of the rhythmic twitching of her hands or the crowd of witnesses shouting the word seizure. Instead, Vance had used the sterile, weaponized language of police procedure to paint a picture of a calculated predator. He described Elena as actively hostile, claiming she had used evasive maneuvers to avoid questioning. The most damning part of the document was the section regarding her physical condition. Vance had checked the box for appears under the influence of narcotics, citing her slurred speech and lack of coordination as signs of drug-induced aggression rather than neurological distress. Even more insidious was the complete omission of the medical ID bracelet and Elena's nursing scrubs. In Vance's report, she was simply a subject in dark clothing, a phrasing clearly intended to dehumanize her and strip away the professional credentials that would have made his use of force look like the negligence it was. The shift report acted as a secondary assault, a paper-and-ink attempt to assassinate Elena's character to save Vance's career. It was a narrative of resisting built on a foundation of lies, intended to trigger the city's qualified immunity protections. But the paper trail didn't stop at the shift report. Thorne uncovered a series of internal messages sent between Vance and his shift sergeant shortly after the booking. "She's claiming it was a medical thing," Vance had typed. The sergeant's reply was chilling in its brevity. "Stick to the resistance. If she was fighting, she wasn't sick." This digital fingerprint proved that the lie wasn't just a rookie's panic. It was a systemic choice. They had seen the truth in her eyes and the badge on her chest, and they had chosen to ignore both to preserve the image of the precinct. As Elena read the report, her shaky left hand gripped the paper so hard it wrinkled. They hadn't just broken her nerves. They had tried to steal her truth. But with the report and the video now side by side, the resisting lie was no longer a shield for Tyler Vance. It was the smoking gun that would cost his city $7 million. The courtroom was filled with a heavy, expectant silence as the trial reached its 7th day, but the atmosphere shifted the moment the civilian witnesses began to take the stand. These weren't medical experts or high-priced consultants. They were the people from the mall concourse, the strangers who had been forced to watch a tragedy unfold in real time. One by one, they sat in the witness box and recounted the same haunting story, creating a mosaic of shared trauma that the city's defense team could not dismantle. A young college student, her voice trembling, described how she had tried to show Officer Vance a medical video on her phone to explain what a seizure looked like, only to be barked at and told she would be arrested for interference if she didn't step back. The most visceral testimony came from Sarah Jenkins, a mother of two who had been sitting just 10 feet away when Elena first leaned against the glass. She didn't talk about police procedure or tactical maneuvers. She talked about the look in Elena's eyes, a look of profound vulnerability that she said would haunt her dreams. Sarah wept as she described the moment Vance's knee connected with Elena's spine, the sound of the air leaving the nurse's lungs, and the way the officer had looked at the gathering crowd not with a sense of duty, but with a terrifying, cold-eyed hostility. "We weren't a mob," Sarah told the jury, her gaze locking onto Officer Vance at the defense table. "We were human beings begging another human being to be kind. But he looked at us like we were the enemy because we dared to tell him he was making a mistake." As these testimonies piled up, the warrior narrative Vance had built in his shift report began to crumble. The jury watched as the mall-goers described being treated like criminals simply for testifying to the truth of a medical emergency. They spoke of the blue wall manifesting in real time as backup officers arrived and immediately began pushing the public back, ignoring the pleas for an ambulance in favor of securing a crime scene that didn't exist. By the time the final witness stepped down, the $7 million figure being sought by Marcus Thorne didn't seem like an arbitrary number. It felt like the only way to quantify the collective failure of a department that had chosen to threaten its citizens rather than listen to them. Elena sat at the plaintiff's table, her damaged hand resting in her lap, feeling the weight of the city finally beginning to tip toward the truth. The people had seen her when the officer wouldn't, and now their voices were the only evidence the jury needed to see. The defense's strategy of unified front suffered its most devastating blow when Sergeant Robert Miller was called to the stand. Miller was a 30-year veteran, a man whose silver hair and weathered face commanded an immediate, quiet respect from the jury. He had been the lead training officer at the academy when Tyler Vance was just a recruit, and as he sat in the witness box, he refused to look at the defense table. Marcus Thorne didn't approach him with aggression. He approached him with a request for the truth. When asked to review the body camera footage of Elena's arrest, the courtroom went dark, the flickering blue light of the mall concourse reflecting off the sergeant's stoic expression. "In your professional opinion, Sergeant," Thorne asked as the video paused on Elena's twitching hands, "is this the behavior of a person intending to evade or assault an officer?" Miller took a long, heavy breath that seemed to carry the weight of his entire career. "No," he said, his voice resonant and clear. "What I see there is a textbook medical emergency. We spend 40 hours in the academy specifically on crisis intervention and medical recognition. We teach our recruits that noncompliance is a behavioral choice, but a seizure is a physiological mandate. The brain has lost the ability to follow a command. To treat a person in that state as a resistor isn't just a mistake. It's a failure of the most basic principles of policing." The courtroom was pin-drop silent. The blue wall didn't just crack. It crumbled under the weight of an insider's integrity. Miller went on to explain that every sign Vance had ignored, the vacant stare, the repetitive movements, even the post-ictal confusion, were all explicitly covered in the training manuals Vance had signed off on only months prior. He testified that the use of a knee-to-spine takedown on a person experiencing a neurological event was not only outside of protocol, but was inherently life-threatening. Vance sat rigid, his face flushing a deep crimson as his mentor dismantled his defense piece by piece. Miller's testimony stripped away the split-second decision excuse that the city had been leaning on. He made it clear that the tragedy at the mall wasn't caused by a lack of time, but by a lack of character and a refusal to see the human being behind the subject. When the sergeant finally stepped down, he didn't return to the gallery of officers in the back of the room. He walked out the main doors, leaving a shattered silence in his wake. The message was unmistakable. The badge was never meant to be a shield for ignorance. And for $7 million, the city was about to learn that lesson. The jury was out for less than 4 hours, a time frame that suggested the deliberations weren't a debate, but a collective exhale of indignation. When the 12 men and women filed back into the courtroom, they didn't look at the city's legal team, nor did they look at Officer Tyler Vance, who sat with his head bowed, the weight of his looming unemployment finally settling on his shoulders. Their eyes were fixed on Elena Roberts. As the foreperson handed the verdict forms to the bailiff, the air in the room felt electric, charged with the gravity of a moment that would redefine the city's accountability. The clerk's voice was steady as she read the findings: liable for excessive force, liable for battery, and liable for the intentional infliction of emotional distress. Then came the number that would make national headlines: $7 million in total damages. Elena didn't cheer. She didn't even smile. She simply closed her eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath, her damaged right hand resting on the table, a permanent reminder of the price she had paid for this victory. The money was a staggering sum, but in that courtroom, it felt like the only language loud enough to pierce the ears of a department that had spent months pretending she didn't exist. The fallout was swift and absolute. Within 48 hours of the verdict, the chief of police held a somber press conference announcing that Tyler Vance had been stripped of his badge and his service weapon, his career ending not with the heroism he had envisioned, but with a shameful termination for conduct unbecoming an officer and falsifying official records. The warrior mindset he had cultivated had proven to be his undoing, and the city's insurance premium skyrocketed as a direct result of his 12 minutes of ignorance. But for Elena, the story didn't end with a check or a firing. Though she would never hold a surgical needle or a stethoscope in an ICU again, she found a new way to heal the community that had stood by her. Using a portion of her settlement, she founded the Elena Roberts Initiative, a nonprofit dedicated to training law enforcement across the state on medical crisis recognition. She transformed the mall concourse from a site of trauma into a classroom, teaching new recruits that the first step of policing isn't control, but care. She traded her scrubs for a podium, proving that while a rookie cop could break her nerves, he could never break her spirit. The $7 million was the price of a mistake, but the change Elena forced upon the world was priceless. She was still a healer. She had just found a larger room to practice in.